Good evening, and thank you for tuning into our panel discussion, Ellen Emmet Rand, Portraitist and Equestrian. My name is Valerie Peacock. I'm the Clarice Robert H Educator at the National Sporting Library and Museum. I'll be the moderator for tonight's panel discussion and would like to welcome Claudia Pfeiffer.
Hello.
The George L. Ohrstrom Jr. Head Curator at the National Sporting Library and Museum, author and grandson to Ellen Emmet Rand, Peter Rand. William Harris, the Deputy Director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum.
Hello.
And Dr. Alexis Boylan, the Director of Academic Affairs at the UConn Humanities Institute and the Associate Professor of Art and Art History Department and Africana Institute at the University of Connecticut.
Hey.
Our panelists met in 2016 at a writer's retreat organized by Dr. Boylan and the UConn to discuss, research, and write about portrait painter Ellen Emmet Rand's life. The culmination of this project is the forthcoming book entitled Ellen Emmet Rand, Gender, Art, and Business, edited by Dr. Boylan and published by Bloomsbury Academic. Pfeiffer's research also led to the National Sporting Library's Museum recent exhibition and catalog, Leading the Field, Ellen Emmet Rand. And if you haven't had a chance to see that, we do have a virtual tour of that up on our website. The focus of tonight's panel's discussion is to examine a driven American portrait painter whose career spanned 4 decades and her success through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into our first set of questions. So what is it about Ellen Emmet Rand that drew you to her scholastically or from a collector's point of view? I'd like to kind of start with Mr. Harris on this one.
It was an intersection of several things, and of course knowing Alexis as I have for a long time, but also my more general interest in portraits, and then more specific interests in the 1920s and 1930s, which overlap very much with my day-to-day life at work, dealing with the Roosevelts. So it was several things all came together in one nice, neat package. And I'm just fascinated by both the pieces, but the stories around the pieces, most especially. And that her diaries fill in so many points, but also leave so many unanswered questions too about some of the works. And so that from a collector's perspective is how I've gotten involved over the years.
Do you have any favorite pieces and stories?
Oh gosh, favorite pieces, yes. Pretty much the exhibit at the Benton, I would have taken 95% of the portraits off the wall and gone home with them. So there are, more earthy reasons I like some of them, and then there are more like artistic reasons I like others. So I'll try to keep it on a higher plane here. But no, I don't even want to say. I love the one of the twins who died. I love it has an amazingly tragic story around it, and the power of portraiture and that the family wanted to posthumously remember and honor them. So that one in particular stands out to me.
Hard question. There's so many that are really good.
I know, that's a really tough question.
Anyone else like to jump in on why they maybe got interested in her scholastically or from a collector's point of view?
I can jump in. I'm really interested in, as an art historian, and I think, as someone who isn't necessarily in the museum world, I think one of the things that was really interesting to me was to think about sort of what careers we remember, what art gets remembered, and what artists seem to sort of be incredibly popular, incredibly famous, incredibly networked at their time, and then sort of fall out of the art historical narratives. I find that an interesting question because it actually says more about the narratives that we create and the knowledge that we create about art than it does necessarily about sort of the quality, like the quality of the art or that sort of thing. So I think one of the things that was really just interesting to me, I have to admit that before I actually started working on Ellen Emmet Rand, I hadn't really heard of her before. And then as soon as I started working on her, I was like, why don't we all know about her and her career? Why is she not more famous? And then I think it's particularly interesting to sort of think about how actually very hard and very good she was at creating a career during her lifetime. But because of issues of gender, because of issues of sort of how people get remembered art historically, and a certain kind of misogyny that exists in sort of a broader academic context or scholarly context, how she got forgotten. So I think that that whole process was just very interesting to me. And I have to say, I do have a favorite, and it's a new favorite. And Claudia, it is in your show. It is the portrait of the three brothers with the horses and the dogs. I had not seen, I had seen an image of that before, but I had not seen it in its sort of full glory. And I have to say, and I'm going to just give a total shout out to watching the online exhibition. I didn't have a chance before the pandemic to come down and see the show. And the online exhibition is amazing. And Claudia sort of talking through each of the images is so interesting. It is my favorite exhibition I have seen this year, in person or online. But that piece is a knockout. And I think you did such a great job also hanging it. It has its own wall, and it's just such a glorious piece. And it's not a typical Rand. I mean, but then it's also all the things that she loves in her world, her three boys, horses, and dogs. So there you are. It's like all of Rand in one big painting.
Wow, I thank you, Alexis. That you just like made my year, like literally. You know how it is. As someone who does this too, you spend a lot of time at your computer thinking about it, and it's not a reality until other people kind of engage with it, and you hope that you hit a good mark with it. And you actually kind of stole my answer, which is really funny. We settled on the same painting. I can't tell you when I so that one is from Rosina's collection, and I had gone to visit her in Salisbury, and we went through a tour in her house, and the last room is this sunroom, and there's a French doors, and this painting hangs over the French doors. Wow. Right? And so when I saw it there, and all I could think was that whole summer where she had been writing about the big canvas of the boys and the horses, and I'm like, there it is.
Right.
So it's more than a big canvas.
It's a big canvas. So yeah. So we were really excited that Rosina was so invested in lending in terms of like, especially the narrative downstairs. A lot of the more personal direction really comes from her generosity in lending. So we were really excited for her to be involved.
Peter, do you have any favorites?
Oh, well, first of all, I want to add my voice to say that I think that Claudia, you've done a fantastic job from what I've seen. And just like Alexis, I was not able to come down, but what I've seen online is beautiful, beautifully displayed. And I did have some friends who were able to come to the show and see it and who admired it. So I was very excited to be able to see it myself. And I think I love the paintings of the boys, the three boys. I love the one of my father in the arms of the groom, which is mine, but I love it anyway because I think it's a beautiful painting. I also do find that I'm very impressed by the way that the fox hunting portraits are hung. Yeah. This is wonderful. And you know, you can see in it two things, I think. One is the depth of seriousness of Ellen Emmet Rand's vision and intelligence, the depth of her intelligence in portraying people, so that they are not sort of, sort of paintings of merely elegant people in their fox hunting outfits. They're very interesting people to look at, and what it all means to them seems to be in those paintings. There's that collaboration thing going on, I guess, but also their costumes are so wonderfully painted that you really have something that seen all together makes them quite amazing, I think.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you guys liked the exhibition. I'd like to jump to a second question, kind of going off a little bit what Dr. Boylan mentioned a little bit earlier, she completed over 700 portraits, and she was one of the most highly paid female artists of her time. So why did her success and reputation pretty much nearly disappear after her death? Anyone would like to touch on that?
Don't you think the war itself changed a great deal in American life and American art and culture, so that what she represented in the world that she represented really wasn't there the way it had been anymore, and people were moving on. That's one thing that occurs to me.
I think also she struggled with the idea that she was a commission painter. Most of her artworks were behind closed doors, cherished by family members, or in other instances, unfortunately, forgotten by generations that continued moving forward. And so she didn't have that sort of full footprint in museums to be able to have that recognition percolate through to the present.
Yeah, I'm gonna just give a more sort of like political feisty answer. I think that there are lots of sort of, I think Peter's absolutely right. I think the war changed a lot of things. What I would say though is that actually in the late 60s and early 70s is like a great rise in sort of the cultural currency of the WASP. And so you would have imagined, in fact, that, you know, along with Updike and a number of other sort of people who really brought to the fore a certain kind of culture that had really dominated in American sort of cultural and visual culture in the 20s and 30s would have come back around again. I think you can also make I think it's not an incomplete sort of story to talk about how portraiture falls out more generally, and the rise of sort of photography and that sort of thing. I would say, though, that there are still a lot of people who are working, who make beautiful portraits. There's still a lot of men who are recognized as great portrait painters. No one forgot about John Singer Sargent. You know, I mean, we don't forget about a lot of people. And so I would say that I again, want to just sort of mark that I think gender does become one of the main, you know, she doesn't have a widow to take care of her posthumous career. And you see that that is actually such a crucial component, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for building the museum to gallery to artist sort of pipeline, in terms then also of art history. I would also say that the version of who deserves to be remembered as a female artist gets really narrowly focused on Georgia O'Keeffe. And this is no shade to Georgia O'Keeffe, but there becomes this sort of model of who a female painter of the 20th century should be. They should be modernist in style. They should be avant-garde in their politics and their life. You know, a couple of good sex scandals, some like, you know, some amazing photographs of them out in the desert. And again, I'm a huge fan of Georgia O'Keeffe, but it becomes this way in which she becomes the focus of what female painters and their careers were like in the 20th century. And yet I would argue she is not actually typical. She's not the model. She is exceptional into the story, and that Rand is actually far more typical. A working artist, an artist who needs to pay attention to the paycheck. If it's not coming in with commissions, it's coming in working at an art institution or being a professor or an art teacher. And finally, family. You know, having to take care of a family, both financially and emotionally and physically, you know, like, you know, 3 kids, she has 3 kids in 3 years. That's a lot of children, and childcare. And so again, I think I would actually just say, I'm going to put a little spice into this and say that there's all kinds of sort of nice answers about why she falls out, but I think it's a little bit more, it's a little bit more a statement about how we quantify or visualize sort of female productivity and authority in visual culture. You
mentioned that the wives would posthumously take care of the art afterward. Do we know if Blanchard took care of her art afterwards? Do we have know anyone about that?
We do know that he did not.
That he did not.
Not do a very good job, no.
We do have her diaries, though, which is fantastic. They have been an amazing source for the exhibitions and learning about Rand. And I know we were lucky enough to kind of really delve deep into reading a lot of her diaries. And there's a quote in there that I really like in one of them where she says, quote, "I know that I'm hard to live with because I'm so energetic. I feel as if I have to accomplish something every minute," end quote. So I just want to know, what is it like to actually live with her and live with her type of energy? And what does this energy actually tell us about her work ethic and her artistic perspective?
Well, would you like me to say something first?
I would really like you to say something.
Well, first of all, I gave this some thought, and I do not think that she was hard to live with. I think that she may have thought so, and people may have told her that from time to time. Her husband probably always was bothered for one reason or another, and I'll get into that a little later. I would say she was a great force of warmth. And a tremendous force of good nature and warmth to her sons and to her husband. And she was sort of like a hurricane. When she came up from the city on weekends, she arrived and suddenly, you know, it was a different place. She filled the house with her activity and warmth. But she was a disorganized bohemian when she got home. And she was part of a family sort of verbal storm system. And so, you know, she couldn't organize herself because she was constantly being distracted by the telephone. Her sisters lived in Salisbury and they were all talkers. And they loved to find out what everybody had been doing and what was going on and talk about people. That was what they really passionately cared about. So if you've seen Rand's book about their life in Paris and the letters that they wrote to each other, you can get a very good sense of that. So I would say just that she was, you know, probably aware that people sort of were kind of like dropping everything when she was there, and she was sort of dominating the scene. When she channeled this force into her work, of course, she was there was a tremendous concentration of achievement that I think she took with her in different ways. That's
it's interesting what you say about the house and up in Salisbury, because the diaries are so clear. They kept the bootlegger busy for in many ways because it was a rolling. There were guests in and out of that house all the time. People up from the city, people coming up, old friends. It was just constant entertaining. You can tell that that kind of flurry of activity must have appealed to her, because she spends more time talking about that by far than she does about her painting, other than to mention business aspects. A lot of discussion of the business aspects of her painting, but you don't get a real insight into the, like, her thinking about art. Or in Alexis or Claudia may weigh in on that, but you do get a lot of sense of how she's interacting with people and how many people are coming in and out of her house, how many friends and family she painted, as well as formal commissions. The one behind me, in fact, is just a friend from down the street that she chose to dress up in 19th century garb and paint. She didn't get any money for it. Of course, she didn't get any money for a lot of her early 1930s portraits either. But yeah, I agree. I think there must have been a warmth. There must have been a people-loving aspect of her that wasn't aloof and cold and difficult.
I think the diaries offer almost a voyeuristic understanding of her in her middle age too, right? Because the diaries, they drill down from 1926 to 1941. So we get sort of that mature woman with her family who obviously is very much invested in her children on a personal level and an emotional level, and wanting to succeed, to see them succeed, and in a lot of ways starting to live vicariously through them as they get older. And she's starting to, you know, become older and older and having more difficulties, say, in riding, which she loved to do with her children. And there's that connection there. And she's like, there's always this, the thing that's really fascinating to me is the idea that she was very bohemian and maybe disorganized, because her diaries are so structured. right? In terms of she's going to tell you chronologically how something happened. And if somebody died, she'll tell you what she had for breakfast first, right? It's like, so there's that kind of, and I think that's also that kind of classic, you know, how you write a diary. She was very much in that lane, but there's a lot of a great insight in terms of her character. I see a lot of stoicism in her in a lot of ways in terms of her diary.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I wonder if it a little bit has a darker edge to it too, that I think from a very young age, her life is defined by picking up and moving and living with different family members. And, you know, it seems like by the time she's about 16, 17 years old, she's making money for the family with illustration and that sort of thing. I wonder how much of this energy is actually a kind of trauma response to there being lots of money and then not a lot of money, but always having to look like there was a lot of money. Again, you know, I think that having a lot of people come over, one way of sort of imagining that is as like a joyous sort of like, you know, oh, open house, that sort of thing. I think the other part of it is that she's also taking care of her mother and her sister for their whole lives. They don't seem to really work very much. You know, I mean, so I guess I sort of wonder around the edges of the sort of part of this that seems very sort of dreamy and like country home-ish. All of that actually is being essentially most of the time paid for by her. So, you know, all of Yale and all of the fancy boarding schools and all of the horses and all of the travel and all of that has to, you know, somebody's got to pay for that. And so I wonder if a little bit of the being hard, manic energy was also a response to a childhood that seemed to be, you know, there's a lot of time where we don't really exactly know where she's living, who she's living with, you know, that there seems to be a constellation of relatives that are housing them and that sort of thing. So I also sort of wonder how much of this was as soon as she had the funds to create something that was going to, like, she was just going to hold on to that. But, you know, I mean, I think we are all sort of, that sort of, what's been so great about this project is actually sort of pulling out the complexity of her. How she presented herself is very sort of like, I'm a wealthy woman with my 3 beautiful children and we ride horses and everything is grand. But the diary is complicated and gives this picture of real sort of struggles. But also, I think all the amazing research that has come out has also sort of highlighted that, you know, life is complicated, and her life was as well.
And money, it's clear, I know, and what she is constantly worried about money. And of course, my focus is on a period in the early 30s when, you know, it was a disastrous economy, and portraiture is a luxurious addition to life, not a necessity. And so it strikes me, and she references exactly what you say, Alexis, and she actually references, I've had to work my entire life. And I can't just put it down. It's this tug. She loves to paint. There's this part of her that is she's an artist. She needs to paint. Inside herself, she needs to paint. And then she needs to paint to pay the bills. So that's got to be a difficult tug of war occurring in you too. The very thing you love is the thing you have to do in order to create this life that you want, but that you also have to present in order to get clients. Poor portraitists aren't very popular. You've got to be able to mix, mingle, dress, drink, eat, and with the people you're painting as well. So that appearance, I've seen that in so many portraitists, the way you present yourself is as key as the quality of your art. So many.
I would say, I'm sorry to interrupt. I feel like she is such a great artist for this historical moment. She is a 20th century artist. She's part of the gig economy. And the way that she pivots in when the Great Depression hits, I think we're watching this happen now with a number of professions and a number of people who realize, okay, well, this stream of what was happening isn't going to work anymore. I've got to pivot. I've got to figure out something new. I've got to start writing some letters. I've got to start, I've got to start marketing myself a little differently. And in that sense, I think she is really this fabulous artist for thinking about this moment that we're living in, where there was one set of rules, there was easy money, there was big parties and all this stuff. And then one day that stuff shuts down. And she pivots amazingly well, I have to say. Not without a lot of hardship, but the pivot is fascinating to watch. And that's all, again, in the diaries. Yeah.
I think there's also one of the really fascinating parts about that is I had a really interesting conversation with a contemporary sporting painter by the name of Andre Potter, who today he's kind of the go-to. And he was talking about how in 2008 during the recession, how what he saw was that mid-tier of his commission base falling off. And he's still able to find at that upper level, there's that insulation from what's happening economically that carried him through. And when you look at, I think that's the thing that was so riveting for me in terms of looking at where the sporting portraits exhibition sits in her career. In the back end of that, quietly, fox hunting is most broadly followed this in this country during that time period, right? So she's found that lane of people who are still able to continue in this channel. And they're not new people to her really so much. They just hadn't done a sporting portrait yet, per se. So I think that there's this sort of really, again, that idea of the trajectory. She was always looking for who the next person was to paint, right? And put that check in the bank and go on to the next one. And there's also this sense of almost a compulsion about it, because she wrote that way in 1927, right? She wrote that way in 1928. When she was doing well and was pretty established in her career. So I think it's really fascinating personality-wise. She's always kind of living to the edge of what she's bringing into the bank.
That really kind of leads us into.
Yeah, that's Claudia, definitely. She is always living right up to the edge of I love that. Times are horrible. They're really tough. Gosh, those boots at Brooks Brothers and that fur at Saks, necessity. And why not? She's earning the money. Yeah. But her diary is so rich in that, just seeing how she approaches life.
That kind of is a great question for were they successful in this town and country lifestyle? And what were her feelings toward Hamlet Hill and then her studio in New York? So she has this complicated life. So does anyone want to touch on that for us?
Well, I think her country life revolved around her family, her sisters and her mother, as Alexis has pointed out, and her husband, WB, as he was known. They all have different nicknames, but WB was what they usually called him until fox hunting came along and he became known as the Beagle. But in the country life, she was able to keep. Now, I have a very strong idea about my grandfather, which has not been expressed in exactly this way, but I do think he was bipolar. And I think he came from a very fancy Long Island polo club world. His father was very well off, he was a successful businessman. And his father, I think, probably recognized this in him when he was about 18 or 19. But at some point, he bought a farm for WB in Williamstown, which is where he was living when he met my grandmother. And he was 27 and she was 36. And I think the reason he was put there or went there was because he was manic depressive, and he was extremely manic depressive all his life. And this shows itself in the temper and the self-medicating, which was the tremendous amount of drinking that he did, and the kind of occasional deep winter despondency. But he was he was somebody who had to be taken care of. So she loved him. She adored him. She adored him because he was so good looking, for one thing. She had never seen anyone as good looking as he was, whom she possibly married. And she married him. Recognizing that and some of the problems that he had, I think they set up the farm together. Never made any money, but it gave him something to do. So there he was. He had a farm, and he was looking after dairy cows. And And it was a dairy farm. So, and her sisters and mother were right down the street. So they were right there. This gave everyone a home. And then she had 3 boys in a succession, but she was making good money, so she could afford after a while to bring in nannies to look after them. So she could go down to New York during the week and work in her studio, which is what she really wanted to do. And she had this scene in the country, this beautiful scene, which is the one that she sort of envisioned anyway. But what the importance of it was to her was that she could come back there. It was not a society scene, you know, as in town and country. It was more a place where she could go to be with her boys, to be with her husband, to ride. It's true, she loved to do that, but also to paint in freedom. And that's where she painted the paintings that you like so much.
Yep.
And
Yep.
That's where she could go. And that was the world. And then when she was doing her work, back to New York.
Anyone else like to say anything about Hamlet Hill versus her studio apartment? I think you've wrapped it up pretty perfectly as well, Peter.
I mean, I think financially and in terms of her career, having that New York studio and home base was crucial. I mean, I think having the ability to have patrons come in. I think one of the things that William in his essay in the forthcoming book about Ellen Emmet Rand, and actually then Susan Spiegel, another one of the contributor highlight, is actually how much, and actually, I mean, this is really clear from Claudia and the current exhibition, is actually how many people who lived outside of New England were in fact also patrons. So that having this studio in New York, I mean, I think that it wasn't always appropriate, you know, I mean, I think a lot of the reason also, you know, a woman who had a studio also needed to have a husband, because it was always still inappropriate for you to just be like a single woman in a studio having people come in and out and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of pieces to it, but the studio in New York, aside from just being a quiet place to work, was also like a professional place to meet patrons, to show them work, you know, and to perform that aspect of her career that she really did need to. I think for me, when I was working on it, I actually often had a kind of Mad Men reality to her life, a reverse Mad Men, where, you know, she was the banker who would, you know, worked in New York City during the week and then went out for family and fun and sun on the weekends to the country home. But that part was crucial, because I think I think she would have fallen into a far more regional and far more closed off. I don't think she would have been able to make the kind of money she made if she didn't have that New York studio. That's the thing that separates her from actually so many other Connecticut women artists that, you know, were in New Haven or were in, you know, just in small towns and just sort of had their house and had a more regional clientele. She really did have a pretty national clientele, and part of that was her ability to show off her work in a studio.
So we've all kind of touched on that the Rands as a whole family were really into sporting culture, but did that have any sort of influence on her artwork itself? I know it's Claudia.
I think that really that's sort of where the core of my interest in her came into being, because when we all presented our topics for research for the UConn project, there's such a little footprint in terms of her equestrian background, in terms of the art historical context that was available at the time. And knowing who the sitters were for that exhibition that she did in 1936 really pointed to the idea that she did have a broader footprint in the equestrian world, because you don't show up at the front door of Fletcher Harper's house and say, hey, can I paint your picture? That doesn't, you know, so like she obviously had some sort of entree that had to be genuine. And that was one of the really fascinating parts about being able to go into the archive and kind of drill down into that and focus on that a little bit more and say, what do we see historically in her life building up to what becomes this thing that is the 1936 exhibition that's late in her career? And when you look for it, they're there. That's what the exhibition really is about, is this idea that she did. She loved to sketch what was around her on the farm, and she loved the animals that she was surrounded by. And, you know, there was a joy and a connectedness to Hamlet Hill that really fed her soul in a primal way. And there's a lot of discussion when she's in the city saying how much she wants to be at home. And when she's at the farm, how much she wants to stay. And she really didn't like to go to do commission work. That was a chore for her. She would complain bitterly from the second that she left home to go to get on the train until she came back. And I think in a lot of ways that also fed her efficiency, where she could go in a week and finish a complete full-size portrait in 4 to 5 sittings. It's kind of mind-boggling to contemplate when you think about what she could do. So that might have been the roundabout way of saying it, but I hope that answered. Yeah.
Yes, it answered. Anyone else would like to touch on that? Okay, great. Move on. You answered it perfectly, Claudia.
Thanks.
Portraiture as an art form possesses power. It's a collaborative process between the sitter, the artist, and eventually the viewer. So I'd like to start with Dr. Boylan first. Is there any correlation between Rand's chosen art form and the collaborative nature of it and her personality as an artist?
Oh, that's an interesting way to think about it. I mean, I do think that, you know, if anybody is out there looking for I don't know, like a topic of scholarship or anything, we really don't know a lot about early Rands. They would probably still be in France and England. And by that, I mean the works that she produced when she was a student. And what we do see, and what often it was not signed, and so what pieces that we think might have sort of been by her are a lot of landscape images. So, I mean, I do think that she came to portraiture because that suited her. You know, I mean, she could have picked, you know, other people who worked with Macmones. I mean, he was a sculptor. She could have gone in that direction. You know, she did start off as an illustrator, so she could have sort of moved into more narrative pieces. So I do think it's a mistake to just be like, oh, she just, you know, fell into portraiture, or that's how you made money. There's plenty of different ways she could have gone, and she's clearly talented enough. She could have done, you know, she does large works very well, small works very well. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I come back to this idea that she was interested in speaking to her historical moment. She's not terribly, I mean, there is almost nothing in her diary. I mean, like when something happens in the world, she sort of has like a side comment on it. I think in William's essay, he writes like, oh, the stock market crashed, you know, like as if it's sort of like, you know, somebody dropped a pan in the kitchen and I heard it far away, you know. She's not terribly sort of linked into sort of public events and politics in some ways, because I think that she plays a lot of that out in her portraits. I think that's where she had her voice. I think that's where she found sort of her connective tissue. I think one of the things that's interesting is most portrait painters come to a style, and then even though the times change, they stick to a style. You can tell a Rand is a Rand, but she moves from a 19th century aesthetic into a really sort of interesting sort of progressive era. You know, I mean, she really captures progressive era figures in a very particular way that is different from the people who wanted to look more Sargent-esque. And then, you know, again, she pivots again and really sort of starts to take in you know, Hollywood imagery, or, you know, she's very aware of what's happening and how people want to be seen. And I think that's the collaborative edge. She understands why people want to be remembered the way that they want to be remembered, and she is a willing participant in that. I think one of the things that you can see is that even in portraits that you know, so at the Benton, we have this wonderful portrait of a girl that was she's a woman, home from college, didn't want to sit for the portrait. Her parents made her do it, and she's clearly in a dress that she doesn't really like, and she clearly gave Ellen Rand apparently a lot of guff. It was a piece that was donated by her family, and she always hated the portrait, you know, like, so it's one of these pieces that, you know, was made by your parents and something you sat through and did. But what I love about it is that you can Rand is sympathetic. It's a gorgeous portrait of a woman who's like, I don't want to wear these clothes. And then she has these fabulous painted nails, showing off like, you know what, because I'm my own person and my parents put me in this dress and they put me in this portrait, but I'm in college and I'm a modern woman. And I love that push and pull. And so I think that's the collaborative part that is the best thing about Rand, is that she really was interested in being of her moment and documenting people in her time.
And Alexis, add to that, but it's not faddish. Nope. That's what I find fascinating, and speaks to her as an artist. Instead of, and I don't mean illustration in a pejorative fashion, as is so frequently meant, but illustration almost by its very nature is going to pick up on its times. It's in advertising. It's whereas her painting, because in my essay in the upcoming book, I do compare her to a portraitist who was very notable at the time, who was exceptionally faddish, and his work it just doesn't hold the test of time. Yeah. And it's sort of remarkable, and I think it is exactly that. It is that push-pull. She would comment in her diary, "Oh, this guy's not a good sitter," and you know, you can tell when she's engaged in the work, and then the ones that she just has to she has to get them done. And that tension, one of the portraits I own, Alexis, is also a very unhappy debutante who's been placed in front of Rand and clearly forced to sit for painting she does not want to participate in. But yet you do get that sense of sympathy too. It's so clear. She's like, yeah, I know. I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to make you look happy, and I'm not going to make you look like you're enjoying it. I love that. I love that interchange. She is sympathetic.
She gives that little rebellious kick.
Yeah,
you know? Like
totally.
she's in it. She's in it to really show not the real person. I don't believe in the real person, but she wants to give each one, even the ones that she's tossing off and that she knows like, this kid isn't, this is going to go, this is going to end up in a garage or whatever, like she's like, I see you. I know what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, that speaks to the depth of intelligence in her. She really did have, it's not something that people say about her that much, but she was, because she wasn't an obviously intellectual person, but you can see in her relationships and in her back and forth with Henry James, what she cared about and really understood was people. Mm-hmm. She loved understanding people, and she had tremendous intelligence about them, and she really wanted to get to that in a subject she was painting, I think, so that she really looked for what was not readily available, and certainly she wasn't interested in painting a pretty picture of someone or a fashionable picture. She didn't care about that. She wanted to get to the truth, really, in a way, the way a novelist wants to get to the truth, the way Henry James would want to get to the truth, by actually figuring out what this person is all about. And through talking with the person, and this is why I think portrait painting, rather than maybe landscape painting, was her forte, because this was what she really did so well, this interaction, this ability to communicate with other people, with her sitter, in a way that brought that person out. So that I think is an important part of it.
There's a subversiveness to it too. There's a subversiveness, I think, to it, where she's establishment as establishment gets. Let's face it. But by the same token, she's also, on some of these portraits, she's clearly. You don't always necessarily think that the person that she's painting, that she thinks the highest of their character, let's say. It's there, this little subversiveness, which I think is that's her way of sort of also making a point without having to challenge the very people she needs their money.
They're also speaking to the idea of, like, in terms of her natural adeptness at being able to navigate through the physical geography of a human face and hands. And, she had very some of the diary entries are not flattering, right? They're like, oh, that person was not handsome, or I found her boring, or there are certainly these sort of cutthroat kinds of analytical things that she was navigating through in terms of creating the context of the facial features that I found really fascinating. One of the things I would have never thought that someone could call Henriette Harper's nose a handsome one, just to put that one out there if you're familiar with that painting. She liked Henriette, and therefore it was easier for her to connect with her face, I think, in some way. So those kinds of ideas of landscape versus portrait painting, she really had this keen observational skill to be able to drill down to those ideas.
One of her most famous sitters, maybe, there's an interesting story about trying to connect to his face, is FDR, the first presidential portrait. And we get that question asked a lot on tour. I don't know about you, Claudia, but I always got that question asked a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So Mr. Harris, could you fill us in a little bit about her connections to FDR, the painting itself, and the sitting?
Well, what's fascinating about the portrait on many levels is that she wasn't the first choice to paint, as I shared with Alexis. Only later, when I found something just tucked away in the papers there, with the president saying, "Oh, what about so-and-so to paint my picture?" But she had a family connection through the Delano line. So, and she didn't live that far away from Hyde Park in reality, over in Connecticut. And of course, in New York City, they would have all been amongst and around one another on a social level. So the portrait itself, and then of course Eleanor Roosevelt knew her as well. So and we can probably credit Eleanor Roosevelt with getting the commission for it in the first place. But what's also fascinating is that she's a Republican and he's a Democrat, and she really doesn't really care for him as a political leader. And she makes no bones about that in her diary. She doesn't like the way he grins, which is funny because when she painted the portrait, she painted a grin on his face at the height of the Depression, and then had to go back and change it when folks were like, no, we can't have a grin on his face. So she painted 2 or 3. Someone has to help me. I'm not an expert on that picture. 3. And versions of it, which are all very close. I actually don't think that they're particularly good likenesses. I don't think, and I wonder whether it's purposeful. She does. I mean, it was a tremendous economic boon to her. The attention she got for doing that portrait, the levels of notoriety that come from painting the sitting president's portrait, was tremendous. And she recognized that that was a big deal herself. But the portrait itself, I've never found to be a particularly, to my way of thinking, likeness. But sometimes the notion of likeness or not, that's a whole different question. We know what President Roosevelt looks like. I don't know what the debutante looks like. It doesn't really matter in a way. But yeah, so the portrait itself in 33, I think 34, when it was painted, was both in a way, a little economic lifeline, and a cause for celebration, even though she makes it very clear that she wouldn't have voted for him, didn't vote for him, and thought that maybe the election was rigged in Connecticut. But that was the election, she said, so be it. So it's a fascinating place that it came in her career.
William, what about the story that she painted the first one in 32, the big seated portrait, which they really didn't quite like.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked her to do another one, and she came down in 34 and painted the new one, which they did like because it had just that touch they needed of sort of warmth that the first one didn't have. That's a very interesting thing, don't you think?
Yeah, I think the painting of a president is its own, any president is its own field of study, because the painting is serving so many different purposes, depending on who commissioned it and why and where it's going to hang and so forth. And I can't figure out, I've always wondered, is she trying to figure out someone that she kind of has sort of known a little bit. She doesn't maybe really like him, but she knows the commission is so important that she can't necessarily be as subversive as she might want to be. That there are so many different ways this painting can benefit her as much as the president. You can almost sense that tension in the painting. Maybe that's why the likenesses is great, because she's not able to be true to what she really thinks, maybe, or even subversively she's torn by how she must present him. But yeah, I think that maybe some of it is to do with her ambivalence about him. Well, I don't know if it's ambivalence, actually. I don't think she liked him at all. But, you know, you can't screw that one up. You gotta, whatever. I mean, the conversation she has in her diary is she needs the money. And yet she's kind of not wanting to also collect on them or cut them a deal. It's kind of fascinating how she doesn't want to, you know, necessarily make it about money either. There's so much tension going on there with those paintings.
So, I mean, again, I think what's also interesting is that, I mean, I have a theory. I mean, it's not a theory. There's, you know, some documentary evidence. I mean, I think they were all friends in the teens. Mm-hmm. I think that she knew them when she was wilding in New York City. And she was, you know, having parties and, you know, being the sort of single lady about town. You know, she had, you know, when she actually married William Rand, she actually had another fiance too. I mean, she was sort of, she was a wild child during those New York years. And it does seem like she and Eleanor and Franklin knew each other. She was certainly very close with Teddy Roosevelt's sister, Anna Roosevelt, and did portraits. And there was long sort of, you know, Peter, you can probably, you know, nod if you agree with this, but from several Rand people, I've heard that there's a Teddy Roosevelt death mask or hand or something like that exists out there. I could never find any.
She tried to paint him. She talked about this. She tried to paint him. She couldn't, because she said you can't paint with when you have 25 people in the room.
Right.
Talking all the time. And so she gave up on that painting, I think.
Yeah. But I would encourage everybody. Emily Mazzola wrote her a wonderful master's thesis on sort of the controversy about the FDR portrait and sort of the multiple, because one of the other things that Ellen did was she backdated some paintings and so she sort of messed with also the chronology of the paintings. And in fact, in her diary, she's unhappy with the first draft or her first version of the painting. It's actually unclear whether, and forgive me if I don't maybe remember this correctly, it seemed like she was actually the person who put the kibosh on the first draft of it and then went back to look at him again because she didn't get what she wants. And I believe actually in the second sitting, and this I think is, William, you talked about how FDR loved to have his portrait taken. She's in there with Jonas, I'm blanking on his name, but he was a sculptor. So she's literally, there's two artists in there with him doing his portrait while he's just sitting there, you know, I don't know.
Well, he works. He will hardly sit as a true sitter. Working during it. It's interesting you mentioned the Teddy Roosevelt aspect, because the Theodore Roosevelt line is much more, in many ways, in harmony with her family, with what ultimately became her Connecticut life, let's say, than the Democratic Roosevelts of the Hudson Valley. So it's kind of interesting that, and of course she would have known Eleanor through them, since the president was her uncle. But I'm fascinated more about that. She would have probably been more socially aligned with president, in terms of the teens, with President Roosevelt rather than because he was, you know, he enjoyed a good time.
Well, and it was Eleanor. I mean, I do think that there was clearly some tension with Eleanor Roosevelt, because Eleanor's the one who leaked to the press that there was this unhappy first portrait. And, you know, so and they would have been very different. I mean, they're very different models of women. They're coming from the same sort of background, but they clearly had a very different political sort of trajectory. Although, you know, both working women, both sort of putting it together, compromising, that sort of thing. No, it's the FDR portrait. I mean, I do also want to just add, along with the FDR portrait, it's important for us to remember she basically painted every single portrait of every single other important New Deal politician, lawyer, and, you know, that if you're going to talk about sort of who created the visual culture of the New Deal, it's hard to take out Ellen Emmet Rand from that, because it's not just FDR, it is the Secretary of the Treasury, it is the Secretary of Defense, it is, you know, I mean, down the line to like sort of lawyers and judges. She really is in many ways trying to create this new version. And again, it's fascinating, as you point out, that this was politically not her bag, but she becomes the sort of visual culture, you know, so, you know, and it's a tricky moment to be doing portraits of men in power who are trying to restructure government to be more fair. So, you know, you don't want them in fancy suits. You want them in sort of normal suits, but they can't look like they're farmers because they're not, and, you know, I mean, so it's like sort of, again, she's at the front edge of having to restructure what money and education and authority looks like. So I think in that sense, it's fascinating.
That's interesting, Alexis, too, because so many of those New Dealers were in those senior positions were East Coast establishment people. So she would have been a comfortable fit for them as well, in terms of her milieu and association. So at once she's kind of a safe bet too for doing portraits of people trying to radically change the way government was functioning. So that is very interesting to think about.
It's interesting to tie it in with the amazing show that's on right now at the National Sporting Library and Museum. And again, because, I mean, at the same time that she's making this visual, you know, compendium of what a New Deal man looks like, she is also simultaneously creating these sporting pictures. And so, you know, again, it gives you this really interesting sense of this artist who can move between these radically different political, social worlds and make it work for all of them, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I like to kind of think about like why maybe she didn't present herself as a quote horse person, and she presented herself maybe a little bit differently to those individuals. So does anyone want to touch about maybe why she didn't present herself to those individuals as maybe a horse person? Because she was a equestrian.
I'm going to turn over to Claudia. I think Claudia could take this one. I have to say, Claudia has done absolutely amazing research into sort of what Rand, I mean, and I will just say as like a sort of generic art historian, I was like, I don't know what to do with all these pictures of horses and all these people in these, you know, I know that's heresy to your team, but Claudia was amazing and stepped in and did all, you know, knew all of this information and then made these connections with what we had. So I'm excited to hear Claudia sort of get into this, because I do think it is, for many of us, it is like, I don't know, like there's a horse, there's a person in a red suit, you know, is that some military costume? I don't know, you know, so.
I think that definitely her background as a horse person and knowledge in sporting topics really informs her ability to connect with her portrait sitters, and also expands her reputation and her forward-facing idea. But I think socially, those people who were horse people, they knew she was a horse person, and it was part of their family and cultural idea. But in terms of the way that she presented herself to the public, her photographs, I mean, it became a standard uniform for her to have a really loose fitting smock on. She always had her painter's palette in her hand, and she would usually have a fedora on. So very much kind of masking her, where with a riding habit, it's very fitted, right? And she's always complaining as she's getting older that as she's gaining weight, that she has to get new riding clothes. And she's, you know, finding sort of those things that you would expect of a middle-aged rider who's kind of being challenged by the aging process. And I think there's also an aspect of it that because she was really focused on being a professional, I think she was really aware of the idea that she didn't want to be perceived as a dilettante, right? In terms of the idea that, you know, I'm just doing this because I'm wealthy and I have the leisure to do this in my free time kind of idea.
Yeah.
I will say a lot of times people assume that she has money, and I think try to not pay her because of it.
Yeah.
I do think it's a double-edged sword that she's always sort of riding between sort of positioning herself as being of a certain kind of people who can afford a portrait, and then you know, because Bill, as you were pointing out about the FDR, I mean, she's got to go negotiate with, you know, Sarah Roosevelt about how much she's going to get paid. You know, which is not actually how a lot of male portrait painters give a price, and that's the price, and that's done. She was constantly, after a contract was drawn up, having to renegotiate that she would get the full sort of, and I do think that sometimes people were like, oh, you're rich, so, you know, you don't really, you know, like, again, the sort of, oh, no, I actually need that check, thank you very much. You know, it was part of, a lot of the diary is her being like, you know, who hasn't paid their bill, you know, that kind of thing.
There also seems to be this tendency for people to assume that Blanchard, as the patriarch, was the one that actually moved her throughout her career and made those connections for her. But there's a lot of evidence to kind of contradict those claims. And Peter, do you want to jump in maybe on that?
I will jump in. I first of all think you have to remember that her eminent subjects came very early in her career. Mm-hmm. And they came from people like Stanford White, St. Gaudens, Sargent, McKim, of McKim, Mead, and White, who introduced her originally to Sargent, and from even Henry James. But these were very early in her life, but by the time she was 26, she had painted John Hay, a great painting, when he was Secretary of State. She went on the next year to paint Elihu Root, who was also Secretary of State. These are great paintings, by the way, of an earlier time, and using a lot of shadow and darkness, and they're very strong portraits. She met W.B. Probably no earlier than, I'm not sure about this, but I think about 1910. And they were married in 1911. He was 27 and she was 36. And I don't think you would call him ever, at that time anyway, a patriarch. And you certainly wouldn't say that he had introduced her to a lot of the people she painted at that point, because she was living in New York and had been for quite a long time. By then, and for 10 years or so, she was very in the swim of these very eminent people who were constantly directing her one way or another to people she could paint. I think what you can say is, and the claim can be made, that W.B., and I'm sure Claudia can speak to this much better than I can, that W.B., when the fox hunting began in 1929 at Chatham, he brought up there a whole new world of people, his society friends from Long Island, who came up and bought houses up there, some of whom she painted. And then by that time, they were kind of moving in and out of fox hunting circles anyway. And so there, I think in the sporting world, he was very, very helpful, because that was a time, of course, when as both you, Bill, and Alexis have pointed out, she needed the money, and he helped her a lot there. So that was true, I would say.
I think one of the really sort of the grounding components of, we call him Blanchard, she calls him Blanchard a lot in the Dyers too, and B, is the idea that they connected as equestrians in their relationship. And even as early as the mid-1920s, they're going to Middleburg, Virginia, where the Middleburg hunt is very active and a prominent hunt. And Blanchard is known as a fox hunter who was competent in the hunt field, and they were constantly angling for invitations to go hunting then already. And really fascinating aspect of Ellen as a rider too. She's a side saddle rider. She's in the last generation of women who rode a side and learned to jump fences as her boys learned to jump. And she was solidly in her middle age. That's not something that women just kind of, hey, I'm going to go jump on my side saddle and I'm going to go try and jump a fence now. Also speaks to her character. And the idea that that part of her was something she passionately wanted to do, and documented sort of her journey and learning to ride and jump, and have her first amazing ride hunting with Blanchard then in Old Chatham. So it's something that they both as a couple really pursued together quite early on, in terms of when he finally got to the point where first the Old Lebanon hunt, and then the founding of Old Chatham, which was recognized by the Masters of Foxhounds Association in 1931.
So one thing that I find really interesting about Rand is that she did navigate like the complexities of being an artist, being a devoted mother, and being the main breadwinner for the family, and their lifestyle in a time when women did have a lot of barriers to actually do that. So I wondered if anyone could kind of touch on ways that she successfully navigated these various and oftentimes these very conflicting roles at the same time.
Well, she had very conservative values, I think, in many ways. She was conservative. She had conservative values in her work, in the way she painted, in the way she applied paint to the canvas, in her training, also in her private life. In many ways, she was had a conservative outlook, and she was deeply devotional as a person. And my father thought that she was a religious person, really, even though, because when he told her he didn't believe in God, she was absolutely horrified. And she said, "You have to believe in God." And she was a person, and she shows that in the amount of devotion that she put into her whole life. I think that she had the advantage of growing up outside the oppression that is imposed by the social milieu that her family came from. And this is really interesting because she grew up in California. She grew up the first 9 years of her life in San Rafael, California. Her father was a lawyer there. And only when she died did she come back east and back into some of the family fold, where she was not part of society the way it was run. She didn't go to finishing school. She didn't come out as a debutante or anything like that. She was independent of it. And I think that gave her a sort of that started her off as a bohemian, and of course she became an illustrator very early in life, in her teens. But the social milieu didn't influence her too much. So the people she was close to were her sisters and her cousins, and some painters and writers she was close to, and she dominated her surroundings. W.B. was a society person. So in her private home life, she had a sort of conservative outlook too. And they made a very great couple. They were fame and glamour when you put them together. He was a glamorous man, and he was a great athlete, great rider, and known as such. She was this wife who was a professional painter who by the 1920s had achieved her sort of legend. And so I think that she had this personality that was on the conservative side, but also very, very warm and outgoing. And so if you put those two things together, she was both sort of conservative and at the same time, maybe even sort of on the racy side. By the way, I'm sitting below some drawings that she did. On the right-hand side, my own mother and my father. You probably can't see them very well, but these two up here are pictures of people. She did love to do these drawings of friends who came for lunch. She could do them very quickly. And here are two of them, and they're lying down after having a lot to drink at lunch, probably, having a nap after lunch, one and then another. Now, these were part of the entourage that they moved around with. So they had this sort of social life, too, that was really their own world. And they moved back and forth between Old Chatham and the fox hunting world, and then back to Hamlet Hill. But I don't know if I'm making a coherent statement here, but I'm just sort of trying to sort of talk a little bit about that, the two parts of her life.
Yeah, thank you for touching on that. She definitely seems like she has like two parts of her. Anyone else want to like maybe talk a little bit about how she maybe navigated these two different sides of her personality?
Well, I mean, I would say she's a really great person to keep in mind when we use phrases like, oh, someone was like a radical or bohemian, or somebody was conservative. I think, you know, she was like almost all conservative women, conservative until she didn't want to be, or until it didn't suit her, or until something else took precedence. And just like with radical and bohemian women who are often, you know, very traditional and conservative in their own sort of personal lives or their own goals or that sort of thing. I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting for me working on Ellen Emmet Rand was, and particularly as a feminist scholar, was to actually see how really not helpful those terms are. Because, you know, again, we all contain multitudes. And so, you know, I think that, you know, in some aspects, in some moments of her life, she makes very traditional decisions. And in other moments, she makes really radical choices. She lives in a lifestyle that seems like incoherent sometimes with some of the things that she would later do or that she's doing at the time. So, I mean, I think it's actually, she's a really great case study for sort of thinking about how we often allow male artists and male writers all kinds of elasticity in terms of their personal lives and professional lives and stylistic lives, and that we should really be honoring Ellen Emmet Rand with the same nimbleness. Mm-hmm. She is conservative, and she is radical, and she is bohemian, and she is traditional all the time. And I think that gives us a better sort of moving place to really think about her contributions if we don't try to put her in some nice little package. Because every time you want to do that, she'll then just go off and do something else that you're like, well, now wait a minute, that doesn't fit this role. I mean, I think the other thing that's great, and Claudia, you pointed this out earlier, we have so much evidence actually of her later life. Mm-hmm. And so often with artists, what happens is that we sort of get a picture of them in their 20s and 30s. And then, you know, like the sort of the joke about how, like, I hope I'm dead by the age I'm 27 or whatever that sort of thing is, you know, like live fast, die young. Most artists don't live fast or die young. They actually live a long life. And we actually have this really interesting record of the complexity of Ellen Emmet Rand, sort of her changing body, her changing status as a mother. You know, she has grandchildren, she has, you know, daughters-in-law, you know, like they don't stay children, they don't stay, you know, so we have this really interesting picture of moments in her life when she's sort of more happily married, and then moments in her life where she's very unhappily married, and showing this sort of the way in which none of us stay static for very long, that aging is its own process. And again, sort of how she ages as an artist is fascinating. She doesn't age conventionally. She doesn't stick with what she learned when she was 18 years old. She really changes. And you know, by the late 30s and early 40s, she is painting very contemporary women and very contemporary men. And I think that's the thing that I think, and thinking about her as a female painter and the challenges that is, I actually think we ought to challenge ourselves to think differently about how we like to sort of categorize painters, male and female, and non-binary.
So later in her life, she does use the term sporting artist, which she doesn't use that in the beginning part of her life and the beginning part of her artistic career. So I find that really interesting and want to know maybe why you guys think she possibly waited so late in her career to actually use that term sporting artist. Claudia?
So I think that, I don't know that she ever really truly herself embraced the mantle of the phrase sporting artist so much as how did art critics perceive her or label her is really where we kind of see that third person narrative that frames her career. The sporting gallery in New York City was the location of the exhibition that Ellen Emmet Rand had in 1936. And that exhibition included paintings that were begun in 1929. So what they show really is the full trajectory of the commissions that were starting to focus more and more heavily on sporting commission requests. And in that regard, now with the body of work being presented in an art gallery, she's inviting this critique of, and especially with the title, which is Sporting Portraits by Ellen Emmet Rand, saying, look at me in the context of sporting art and putting it out there as part of the title that's there. But she doesn't say sporting artist per se. I think the interesting thing is how critics react to that exhibition sort of from a very lukewarm perspective and brushing it aside as one might expect in the trajectory of what's happening in the New York City art scene, to the more sympathetic critics who understand the commission base that she was working with and see the timelessness that she was reproducing in the works that were in that exhibition. I think it just is another aspect of how fluid she was in her ability to paint people. You know, to me, one of the things that really is a striking, and it's almost an emotional experience, going through the exhibition with people who are still participating in this culture today, who literally will say, I've heard this over and over again in tours, and say, I recognize these people, I know who they are, because it's the next generation of that same kind of classic idea and gravitating towards those traditional and classic composition concepts too. And what you were saying, Alexis, in terms of her ability to be doing those, and then she's doing a painting of a debutante at the same exact time, and she's doing a judge at the same exact time, is again that idea of her, that layer is another extension of her ability as a portrait painter, to me.
Art history, I mean, the history of art is painting people that are alike, creating communities, and creating those communities to last across time. I mean, this is why we have, so many paintings of cardinals, so many that one of the other sort of sub-genres that we haven't talked about and people might not know about is that Ellen Emmet Rand had a whole series of paintings of scientists and academics in the 20s and 30s. She went to, there a bunch of them are at Harvard, a bunch are at Yale, again, and a ton are at Columbia. And when we were doing the research for this, again, it was sort of this subgenre because people like to see themselves as part of a community. So, that as, for example, academia and science becomes more solidified in the middle of the early 20th century as a profession with its own sort of obligations and credentials and that sort of thing, you start to see that the first thing that they want to do is make portraits of themselves. Like, we're really here. There's a thing called a scientist, and look, I'm doing it, and look, I'm in my robes because I'm at Harvard, and, this is going to hang in the law school now. So, I mean, I think in that sense, she's part of this much longer tradition in her sporting images of creating people who have money and want to show that they are part of a community, and that community, giving it a longevity. Again, I think, this is what the Catholic Church did for centuries. This is what, when we look at sort of, Northern Renaissance painting, again, it's all clubs and dining clubs and this sort of thing that's sort of documenting. I had friends, I was part of something, I was good at something, I had a talent, I had knowledge, and this is what it looks like, I think, has this very long, and I think really interesting tradition. I mean, again, I think why is Instagram so popular now? Because it allows us to create our own little networks of photographs of things that we like, of ways to identify ourselves, I mean, I think that this is an earlier process of that same phenomenon.
I think also, Alexis, that's really interesting to hear you put it that way. And I think, you know, it's so true that there are these different groups of people, among whom she moved. And I would suggest that she was socially all-knowing. This was one of her extraordinary characteristics. She really could move around and know people and talk to them with a lot of confidence because she knew where they were coming from. She knew people they knew, and she traveled enough. She was a very, very sophisticated and self-confident person with a lot of intelligence, which, you know, comes out in the conversations that she had with people. And, you know, she knew everyone, and she had no trouble, you know, being able to sum people up and understand them. And that was one of her gifts as a painter, I think.
I also have to say, as someone who's supposed to be a specialist in sporting art, I've always hated that name, that phrase. Right? I prefer to think of it as art that depicts sporting subjects, because once you create this nucleus around this topic, it kind of makes it other, and this idea of hierarchy of art, and is it high art or is it not, and that those kinds of sort of channeling of an ideology or a representational style tends to minimize it by its very word. So I think that in that idea too, what is a sporting artist, right? You go back to the idea of how do you define that based on 19th century ideals, the British tradition that informs what's the American concept. And there's a lot of connections there in terms of what is the 20th century fox hunting culture in the United States that's so Anglophilic in a lot of ways. So it's something that is relatively new here in terms of its popularity and growth and success, but it was actually a very old sport in the United States as well, ranging back to the 17th century. So there's a lot of traditionalist concepts there too, in terms of how to define an artist in the context of sporting subject matter.
Claudia, will you have a special Zoom episode, Talk Fest on that topic? Because I think that's fascinating. And I think that there would be, I mean, I also think that no doubt there are people who are going to fight with you on that, right? Like that is a controversial statement in the sport, art, and I don't even want to use any, qualifiers there. So you guys should do one on that, because I think that's fascinating. And I think you're right. There's multiple ways of thinking about if that broadens the picture of it or if it tightens it up in ways. So yeah.
We'll have to do just a live event, Claudia, put you out there, let people go. I'm down. I can help you with that.
Fire away.
So I know you really hate the term sporting art, but this is the term that is most broadly used, and especially that critics use as well. So I'm really curious in knowing, it's a bit of a broader question, but how have critics evolved thinking about sporting art and viewing sporting art? And then more specifically, how critics and people view Ellen Emmet Rand's sporting art and the footprint that it has on her entire career. Bit of a broad question.
So I think in terms of the idea of sporting art as a realist artistic statement, it kind of is even in a lower echelon than realist art, looking at postmodern concepts, right? Because ultimately representational art gets brushed aside in the high art context of things as we move through the century. I think sporting art really gets ignored in a great chunk of the artistic review by the latter half of the 20th century. It just is something that, you know, we as a library and museum that focus on this topic, and as a museum that is really relatively young in its footprint, having opened the museum component in 2011, we're trying to rectify that, right? That's our mission. That's what our goals are in terms of bringing those concepts back to discussion. I think that there is definitely a sense of revival to the idea of appreciating representational art as a comparable to the other artistic movements that have happened. There's a broadening of understanding in my corner of things. Alexis, do you have thoughts about that?
No. Actually, no, I was like, well, like, what could I add to that? And I don't actually. I mean, I think, yeah, no, I think you pretty much said it. That's, yeah. I mean, yeah. I'll leave it with your. I have to say that one of the great joys of working on this RAND project was actually the ability to meet people like Claudia who had these pockets of knowledge. I mean, one of the things that is exciting when you work on any of these artists is this sort of way in which your world becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. In that, you know, I really didn't have an appreciation for an understanding of the sort of complexity of that sort of dialogue until I met Claudia, and until actually I was able to work with you know, the National Sporting Library and Museum. And I think you know, that's one of the really exciting things about sort of Rand, is all of this connective tissue that she manages in one artist to sort of bring together. That's like sort of an aside, but it is the thing that sort of stands out to me, is this kind of appreciation for actually just sort of how vast sort of, and Peter, you said this earlier, how much she had to know, and then how much we have to know to really unpack her work. Yeah, that doesn't answer your question, Claudia. So, but.
Well, what do you feel like her sporting portrait work has on her whole entire artistic career? I mean, for us, you know, that's kind of like what we focus on, but what about you guys? The footprint of her sporting work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I would say again, I mean, I think this pulls back a little bit to something that Claudia was commenting on earlier. I mean, I see her sporting images or her sporting artist as, and I put those in quotes because I think that for her, it's all marketing. Like, she would be the artist of purple if she would sell 5 paintings. Like, she would be the like, I think to a certain extent, she is nimble, and in that she's not, sure, you want to call her a sporting artist? Great, call her a sporting artist. Oh, did that show not work out? Fantastic. I'll be, you know, do you want me to be an academic painter? Spectacular. Like, I just don't, I think that she is less interested in the monikers and more interested in getting out there, and making herself and her art seen and known. And to me, that actually, so I mean, again, I'm sort of sidestepping, I think, the question, but I think that she's willing to take it on because it's a community that she loves, it's a community that she knows. But I think she's just as willing to be like, oh, yeah, okay, that didn't work out. All right, I'm gonna, you know, she doesn't stop doing any of those paintings. She doesn't stop going. She doesn't stop loving horse. Like, it has nothing to do with the things that made her perhaps good at those things. I also just think that she's good at sporting images because she's interested in people who have passion. She is passionate about horses. She's passionate about dogs. Like, she's passionate about country living. She thinks that it is a preferable way to live one's life is outside with animals. That's, you know, and that's like, she's happiest when she's doing that. Like, that's clear in her diaries. Like, a day with a horse is better than a day with anybody else. Like, you know, I mean, and she loves to look at horses and talk about horses. It's what bonds her with her sons. And I think that to me, what is valuable is like, well, because that just shows how that she's accessible to the part of all of us that has passions for things. And some people it's horses and animals and outdoor living, and some people it's chemistry. And she's able to access that because this is the thing that she loves. So I guess that's sort of like, she gets being passionate and even a little bit obsessive, right? Like, because that's a part of it too. And she's obsessive. I mean, she gets into the details of it. So.
And speak.
Yeah.
Sorry, Peter.
Yeah.
Did you want to jump in? Sorry, I didn't mean to.
I was just going to say that I think also, and Claudia, this speaks to your exhibition. I think that this was a magnificent final piece of her career too. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was really how she ended her painting career. And she did it with great panache and color and beauty. And I think that it was the way she lived her last decade, because she really loved hunting, and she loved hunting with her family. And there was a certain grandeur to the way they lived and to the way they did it. They won medals at horse shows. You know, they were a magnificent looking family, and she just threw herself into it, and painting it was, of course, a very important part of that. And I think it was a very important part of her marriage, because now, at last, WB had a real sort of organization he could run, and he ran it beautifully up there in Chatham. And she was part of it because she helped pay for it. And she paid for it because she painted people who were in it, in part. But it was the last piece of her life that I think you've captured.
The other part of it is in terms of the idea of sporting art, really, it also goes back to the sporting enthusiasts that are commissioning these things, right? And the idea that she was able to get these commissions shows that the sporting people who were seeing what she was doing saw what she was doing as an authentic expression, right? She nailed she understood the details, she understood the concept of the buttons, and that there's this level of detail that sporting enthusiasts a lot of times look in sporting art that is not, you know, in this sort of more impressionistic lane that most people aesthetically tend to gravitate toward, that level of detail, which ranges into illustration for some folks, is really where the level of interest is peaked with a lot of sporting enthusiasts. So I think it really does validate the idea that she was recognized by her patrons as someone who was able to paint these portraits correctly. And there's a really interesting dialogue that she has with, I mentioned Fletcher Harper before, where you know, she really likes the Harpers a lot. They're old guard Orange County foxhounds folks, and he's the master of Orange County. And in the first sittings, they have a good rapport. She talks about how she likes him and how he's fun. And then she really ends up on sort of the second to last day of this commission, she's lamenting that she can't get this right for him, and how he has literally tortured her for a whole day with repainting the bootstraps and the buttons and the little details of his attire, and that she felt like she would get there, but she was really having a hard time satisfying that sense of that level of detail. And yet she does it, and she gets it, and she finishes the portrait commission. And I think on that level, there's that sort of deep inside, not just a cosmetic, again, that idea of a person inside out. It's not a cosmetic understanding. It's a really a holistic view of what's important and what they're wearing and what they're doing.
I get this question quite a bit on tours. I know, Claudia, you have also had this question asked to you. And the big question is why? Why are we talking about her as scholars and museum professionals and personal people that knew her? Why are we digging up all this stuff to bring it back up?
I think I'll start by saying, as an aside, thank you, Alexis, for bringing it back up. I think your work in bringing the UConn project together and getting the Luce grant to write the book was really important. You know, I think you touched on it really well in saying earlier that she had fallen out of art historical recognition, and it was, I think there was a huge hole that needed to be filled, and I think your project really brought it to the plate for us to try and do that.
I mean, it was a joy, and it was an honor, I also have to say. I mean, just to sort of work on her and read her diaries. I mean, you know, I know we all feel this way. Like, you really get to know, I mean, you read 20 years of their diaries, you really get to know somebody. But I mean, I almost might switch the question around to be like, well, why study anybody? Why look at any art? You know, I think why do any of us collect things? Why do any of us study things? Why read? You know, why go to a museum? I think we do it because we're looking for some connectivity. We're looking to see some beauty. We're looking to see some sadness. And I think in that, I mean, I think one of the things that was exciting working on Ellen Emmet Rand was, as I said earlier, getting to actually connect with all these people who have different interests contemporary scholars and also family members like Peter Rand, that everybody had a piece of the story, a piece of Ellen Emmet Rand that they sort of could speak to. And that was really exciting to put together. I mean, I think why Ellen Emmet Rand? Like, well, why anybody? Because she manages to remind us of sort of what makes us human, our striving, our ambition, our fear of being forgotten. You know, I think that for me, she encapsulates a lot of the sort of larger questions about what is the meaning of art and how do we remember one another. I think as a historian, which is what an art historian is, I think, you know, what gets remembered is a question that I'm constantly asking myself. Who gets remembered? What gets remembered? And the sort of corollary of that is what's being made invisible and who's being forgotten. And so I think that, you know, one of the things that was important to me was to sort of unpack how Ellen Emmet Rand found herself invisible while actually hanging in almost every single major museum collection, federal building. I mean, you know, again, I think it's a sort of fascinating, like as soon as you start looking for Rands, they're everywhere. So, you know, again, the sort of question of why Ellen? Well, why anybody? And what is it that we choose to remember? And I think we do have to think about memory as a little bit about choosing. So I choose to remember Ellen Emmet Rand. It seems important to me in terms of thinking about the 20th century and thinking about being an art historian and thinking about how knowledge gets made.
Yeah, I think what Alexis just said was really wonderful, and I sort of I completely agree with that idea. Why is anyone important? And why anyone is important is because we choose to really care about them and to do something about that in understanding them. And I found that in the questions that you've asked, and which I think was wonderful, it was wonderful that you gave them to us in advance, allowed me to go back and look at my grandmother yet again, which I hadn't done in a while, but certainly I did when I went to Alexis's wonderful show and then saw this great show. I think the minute you start doing that, you become engrossed. You become engrossed in how she painted, in the tremendous knowledge and intelligence she brought to the art of painting, and you can't after you know something about that, you really can't not care a great deal about her contribution to the art of the 20th century. It's fascinating, and I think that this is what these wonderful exhibitions have done. And I don't think she's going to go back into oblivion or anything like that. But I'd love to hear what Bill what William has to say about any of this, because he must have some thoughts.
It just strikes me that so often, and with portraits, with a few exceptions, if we start in the late 19th century forward, are solely about their subjects, who they're painting, because they're painting powerful people generally, or wealthy people. It's so often about those people, the president or a notable scientist. But it is kind of nice to turn it around and focus again on the artist and the artistry and what it is about. And I'm talking not from a scholarly perspective, but from a more popular perspective, where personality is often in our culture what we focus on. So it's who's being painted. Well, there's a personality behind on the other side of that canvas too, and frequently with a story far more interesting and engrossing than the person that is being painted. And so what's great here is, and I've certainly buy painting frequently because of the story surrounding it, because I like the way it looks. Not as a decorative object, but as something that's finely wrought. But how much fun it is to explore the person who painted it, and why and how, and then how that fits in with other portraitists, which is what I've found fascinating. Where does she stack in business terms with her contemporaries from around the world, this whole network of portraitists that are out there that you never hear about, who were very notable at their time amongst the people who could afford portraits, and those few who would break through more popularly in the popular culture. So the artists just frequently get swept aside and forgotten. They're just the ones. It's like in motion pictures. It's the people on the screen, not the person who writes it or directs it. So it's very nice to me to be able to explore the person, especially people who, as Alexis says, I'm in archives. My background is archives. So there are choices in archives being made every single day about who gets remembered and who's forgotten. There are overt choices, in fact. We can save this. We will preserve this as important. So to me, it's a natural fit. The painting as a document, and therefore who's creating that document. Mm-hmm. And then what are they imbuing that document with? Since there's no objectivity, there's only subjectivity. And so I find that it's just the whole intersection. To me, that's why when I think of it, I was thinking as y'all were speaking from a collector's perspective. Oh, do you collect Rands? Well, what are you collecting then? Are you collecting hunt pictures, or pictures of people in academic robes, or people, or domestic works of friends and family? Well, it's all of the above. I mean, you may have your preference, but you can't, if you want to collect Rand, then you're going to be looking in many different directions and many styles and thoughts and concepts. And it's like, I guess, portraitists are hard to nail down in that way. And so Rand, if you collect a Rand, I hope you're collecting a Rand because of her as an artist, not so much necessarily because, oh, I like portraits of society ladies or men in red coats. It's so much more engaging than that and complex.
Yeah.
That was an exceptionally long answer. I apologize.
We got it. Thank you. I have one last question for you. And like we said, this is a bit of a kind of a contentious question. There's no like kind of perfect answer here. Is she a sporting artist? You know, should we even consider her as a sporting artist? I know that we have a dictionary of sporting artists, and in it she's just a footnote. So, Claudia, do you want to start off with that one?
You mentioned the dictionary sporting artist, and I think that's probably really where my scholastic interest started, because that dictionary is about sporting works that have been created. It's sporting art in America, right? It's by Turner Reuter Jr. It was published by the National Sporting Library Museum in 2008. And it's a project that he worked on for over 30 years. I had the privilege of being an editor for that and being contributing to that project for about 10 years. It's 2,400 biographies of American artists who created sporting imagery, beginning with the United States as a country. And in that 30-year project, there's a list at the end of the encyclopedia of those who did not meet the criteria to have a full biography, and then we needed to have birth and death date, at least 2 examples of a sporting work, and she didn't meet those criteria in 2008. And so, looking at the research behind another painting of Miss Charlotte Nolan, who's the founder of Foxcroft School, and researching that painting. Coming to the exhibition checklist that was the 1936 show, which lists these 18 incredibly prominent sporting figures in this timeline, it really does start to beg the question of whether or not she legitimately should have been in that encyclopedia, someone who created a legitimate body of work depicting sporting art.
Yeah, I mean, again, coming from a different perspective, I don't find that maybe a super helpful term if the sort of goal is to sort of think around those kind of definitions, as Claudia sort of pointed out, I think very astutely before. Because then I'm sort of like, well, are we gonna, I guess I just sort of fall into like, I would almost bristle at sort of her being a portraitist. She did a lot of portraits. She also did like group images. I actually just don't maybe I don't maybe find any of those terms helpful. She was an artist, and I think it's more helpful to know her time period, quite honestly, than any sort of specific stylistic, or genre. Even style, I think, would be more helpful in sort of defining her than maybe just, a sort of a genre. But on the flip side, if that attracts people to her story, I'll be Ellen Emmet Rand about it. I'll be a marketing person. Like, if it helps, if it brings more people into the party of Ellen Emmet Rand, fantastic. She's a sporting artist.
It's an access point, right?
Yeah.
It's an access point in, to use an archival approach.
Yeah.
I generally like a certain kind of portrait. I would have never thought of a sporting portrait, would have never even crossed my mind. And it's like, they're paintings. They're really impressive paintings. The topic almost doesn't matter. Again, an access point.
Mm-hmm. It's a great way to think about it.
Yes.
Right. Do you guys have anything you'd like to add? Like, if anyone wants to know where they can find out more information about Ellen Emmet Rand, or any last things you want to say about her?
I would just ask everyone to go, if you cannot get to the museum, go through the online exhibition. I think in this pandemic moment, it is one of the most accessible, interesting online exhibits that I have seen. It's really phenomenal, and the ability to sort of click on a painting and see it in high def, and then actually have Claudia talk to you about it. It is like the best personal tour of an exhibition. So that's what I would say, is just everybody go check out the online exhibition. It's spectacular.
I agree, and I want to go to your museum because I haven't had a chance to go, because the exhibit looks beautiful within the facility.
Oh, nice.
So it is very lovely. You've done an excellent job.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the publication of the book.
Yes. Very exciting. It will be coming out. So I'm going to give the safe answer. It will be coming out in December 2020. There is a possibility it will be early, or in November 2020, but definitely in time for the holidays, New Year, all that sort of good stuff. But the book's going to be spectacular. It's got gorgeous color images and, of course, brilliant essays by my co-panelists, Claudia and Bill. It's actually really a great piece. And again, if you're interested in all kinds of aspects, nothing hovers too long. So you get sort of a taste of all these different approaches to thinking about Rand.
Where can people find that if they want to get it?
It will be on Amazon and everywhere in the world, starting in November and December. So Bloomsbury, it's going to be part of a series, Artists and Entrepreneurship. And so I'm sure Claudia will have, as an author, will have some information about it, but you can find it on Amazon too. And I would say December 1st, you could probably pre-order in November if you want that copy in your hand the second it comes out. But it's going to be a gorgeous book, worth the wait. I mean, I hope.
I also wanted to say how accessible the archives were in doing the research.
Yeah,
and,
if you're on your way to come, or you find yourself in Stores, Connecticut, absolutely come to the Benton. The Benton always has their permanent collection. I mean, we're closed now because of the pandemic, but when we reopen, the Rands are always, at least one Rand is always in our permanent art gallery. And then the archives are part of our amazing archive collection. We also have sketches by Rand, her diaries, letters. It's an amazing collection. And that is also not currently accessible, but accessible online. Both the Benton and UConn's archives have a lot of materials that have been scanned and are online. So you can check those out before you go up to Stores.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. This was really fun.
Thank you. It's a great.
Pleasure. Well,
Yes.
Thank you
Take
so much.
care.
All right.